Hey, welcome everyone. I'm here to talk about From Theory to Fiction, which is a lecture and discussion I'll be conducting with Pratt Institute in Brooklyn this week. And although it's a little less authentic, I thought I'd do the recording separately just for the purposes of sound and not worrying about GDPR and that kind of thing. So I'd still love to hear from you who are listening now to the recording, your ideas about some of the questions I pose. And I really appreciate you checking this out. So I'm here to talk about how I use critical theory to create my own fiction, to talk about the creative process more in general, and discuss the relationship between knowledge and art. And maybe if you got nothing more than a couple of book recommendations today, then we're still going somewhere positive. So I'm going to try to keep the talk fairly short, but then there are a lot of extra quotes and ideas on the slides and even in the notes under the slides. So I'll have a link to that from this recording that you can check out later if you want to. So first, a provocation. Does knowledge make us more creative? Maybe another way of thinking about this question is the old idea that children are more creative than adults. To what extent do you agree with that? It's easy to think about children as more creative beings, but if we really think about it more carefully, we might have something different to say. Like this specialist in creativity and learning at Lego, Elizabeth McClure, who says creativity is not the same thing as imagination. It needs originality and appropriateness, something meaningful and relevant. And in the linked TED Talks there, you can hear her talking about the way that knowledge and especially theory as well helps creators to make something new. So sort of by accident, I ended up teaching primary school or elementary school art last year and designing their curriculum at this international school in Basel, where I live. And here you see some second grade work. They did pastiche of Japanese scrolls. And what we did was we learned about haiku writing, we learned about enso, we learned about landscape painting, and we put it all together in the scroll. And rather than just looking at the aesthetic or the language, we were really trying to understand from a more philosophical point of view. And I found that this really helped to push the students in new directions with their creativity. And yeah, just make some really cool projects. They really enjoyed it. And I think they learned something about culture as well. So this is my son, Buzz. He's 4, right? He's a little bit younger in the photos on the left there, but yeah, we study art. There's a ton of art museums in Basel. We're really lucky. And there's a lot of street art too. So we're looking at it all the time. Sometimes, it's a bit much for him, as you can see him falling on the floor in the museum. But I do think that from a very young age, we can help students to appreciate art beyond just giving them a set of colors and saying, go. I think that's really cool too. But I think that you can also help them to look at what other creators are doing and start to think about why they're doing it even. So I don't mean this to look like kind of a CV of where I've studied, but I think it might be helpful just to think about the context I'm coming from when I look at critical theory. And in a minute, I'll talk about other contexts besides being a student that I've understood critical theory and encountered it in different ways. But I didn't know anything about critical theory in high school. And so when I was an undergrad at Bowdoin, I was studying English literature and art history. It's a liberal arts college. So although the work that I did wasn't explicitly interdisciplinary, there was this idea of making connections amongst the classes I was taking in different disciplines, also in the sciences and in other areas. And I both had art historians who helped me with art theory, and I had a great professor, Celeste Goodrich, who really introduced me to literary theory on a deeper level, and I just fell in love with it. So then right after Bowdoin, I was at Boston College getting my teaching degree, which is an MIT. It's kind of half a English MA and half secondary education. And it was actually one of my, rather than the English professors, it was a education professor who was also an English teacher working mostly with inner city schools and their English teachers. And she really encouraged us to use theory in the high school classroom. So she introduced us to a few books about doing so, and we started to experiment with how we could do it. And I actually did a action research project as part of my student teaching, and I found that students responded really well. So after teaching for a few years, I ended up I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to go back to theory a little bit more and to work with it and make something new with it myself. So I wanted to do a PhD, but I talked to Dr. Gina Marchetti, who's now at Pratt, and how I had the connection to come here today. And she encouraged me to start with the MA at Hong Kong University, which was literary and cultural studies. So we really moved farther than literary theory, I would say. We moved into the realm of cultural studies that encompasses a whole lot more about internationalism, interdisciplinary studies than I had encountered before. And really, just because I loved the innovative ways of the department there, I ended up doing a PhD there as well. And so that has shaped the way I use theory in my fiction. I think most of us have non-linear journeys, but sometimes you think about like moving up the ladder in the education world. Sometimes people will talk about that you have to move up the ladder if you want to be a principal. This is where you go. But I've found that my journey has always been very kind of circuitous, and I like that. So I would say, although, I started as a student, I'm still a student. I like to go to conferences at the University of Basel, or I've attended one, big one, international one online recently, and to continue to be a student of critical theory and the arts in general. I've been a teacher for a very long time, about 20 years. I'm not currently teaching, but I'll go back to it in a different kind of way soon, which I'll talk about later, mostly in the high school classroom, but also at university for a short while, and even in the primary school, as I mentioned. Academic writing and researching, of course, was mostly during my PhD, but I'm also doing it now in a different way, which I'll talk about later on. I've worked as a curriculum developer as well for secondary schools. And I think that is really highly influenced by this work between critical theory and fiction and the arts. And so these questions of what does that really mean for students? It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a fiction writer, but what does that look like in their world, and why might it be important to bring it to all students rather than just those who choose to study it at a postgraduate degree, something like that. And of course, fiction writing, which has always been a part of my life, but really became a strong part of what I do during my PhD. Maybe, you might think I was just procrastinating by writing a novel during my PhD, but actually it was, and that might be true to some extent, I'm not sure, but it also came just from the research that I was doing. I felt that, I was studying a lot of quasi-real filmmakers who weren't making documentaries, but were making something about a person's real world, their lives in private, and what that means, and they're playing with identity and that kind of thing, playing with culture. And I wanted to do that in fiction. I think you can do it in academic writing as well. But for me, it just made sense. And I've kept going with that, sometimes on the side, and now it's kind of at the forefront of what I'm doing. These are just some of my favorite books from these times in my life, and they stay on my shelves and they inspire me at different times, or I pull them out and maybe look at a passage to help me with a novel I'm working at, or something I'm working at in my current newsletter. So I mentioned that MALCS, as we call it at Hong Kong U. And it had a lot to do with critical theory, but also bringing together our work in interdisciplinary contexts. So you see literary and filmic texts on there. It was also about law. I took a law and literature class. We had historians come and work with us, philosophers. So it just felt like a freeing and open place to think about saying something important, but not be limited by a certain subject area. And, what I see at Pratt is something quite similar, I would say. It's really about making meaning in the world. And I found the media studies MA explanation, for example, really interesting. It says we understand media creation and media forms to be world-making projects that have histories and politics. Students and faculty investigate the significant social, political, cultural, economic, and aesthetic questions of our time as we read contemporary theory, rethink media forms, and revisit relevant archives to consider the ways in which gender and sexuality, race, nation, and power, as well as technology, mediate our understandings and experiences of the world we inhabit. So, even the MFA at Pratt is focusing on critical theory, history of art, these kinds of things. And, there's that tension in intellectualizing art. Does it enhance or take away from the creative process? Or perhaps there's not any tension at all. So we'll kind of investigate that through this talk, and you can maybe have a thought about your comments on it afterwards. Does everything created fit into this kind of discourse that students at Pratt and at Hong Kong U are looking at? One could argue it does, but the act of creation itself might not, or might be more informed with knowledge gained through critical theory. So some questions to consider implicitly as I go through some of these ideas are: how and why do we use theory? Does it risk intellectualizing art with no other purpose? Does it exclude or include? And are we in a post-theory world? And what does that really mean? Okay, so just last week I saw this in the New Yorker. Literary criticism, but they're talking about theory in here and cultural studies as well. And it's quite an interesting article, because I think for quite a long time, it's quite a long read, and down the digital page, I was like, wow, this is pretty dire. They're talking about, the judgmental nature of it, all this exclusion, the way that there is no money in the humanities anymore, which is often true. And so it just sounded like a really awful situation. But the author, Merv Emery, comes to some more hopeful and optimistic conclusions, really talking about the way that criticism, literary criticism, can be used not just by the privileged, but by many. And so how you see even like reviews on Goodreads, for example, that make really excellent use of post-structuralism or something like that. And I think there's the danger of then saying, well, it's okay to just leave all this stuff at the margins, and, people don't need to be paid for it or professionalized. And it can just kind of exist. So that's the danger. But I think he also suggests that there's a hope that maybe there is a desire to bring it to the forefront, and it's just more a question of how, and where is the funding, and how can we make it a more important part of our society. So it's a good one to check out. I'm sure some of you have read that, but definitely check it out. So yeah, I mentioned post theory, and I'm sure that many of you have looked at this term. It's been around for decades now. And some see it as kind of the death of theory in a kind of freeing way, or in a pessimistic way. You can look at it in different ways. But there's a lot of discourse about how it's more of a bringing together of the many theories that are out there, and not being constrained in the same way as we're not constrained by a subject matter when we do something interdisciplinary. If we want to talk about an idea and utilize queer theory, feminist theory, and post-structuralist theory, and even a little bit of psychoanalytical, if it makes sense in the way that you bring it together, then that's absolutely fine. And it's more about, as you see in the quote here, ethics, aesthetics, truth, value, authenticity, human, and reality, to understand the mindset of the new century. So this is the way that I did theory, especially in Hong Kong. I would say earlier on, I was learning more the different types in a more structured form, and that was probably really helpful to kind of start to bring them together. But my supervisor said, you don't need to be coming from any angle. Instead, use what's out there that makes sense, and think carefully about what that means in terms of epistemology, or the knowledge that you're forming through your investigations. Yeah. So this is something else that maybe I won't read it right now, but you can take a look at how this is kind of turned into cultural studies as well, because now critical theory is much more freeing. We're talking about culture too. We're talking about the international. Here, the hope from the previous article linked says, yet the shifts from high theory to post theory to vernacular theory show theory not as moribund, but on the contrary, in a new viral form, responsive to its time and place, materially engaged, socially symptomatic, critical, opportunistic, a changeling. So it's really exciting. And I think this is the reason that, some people also want to limit it, because it can say so much, it can do so much. And when you look at what's going on in Florida and education, it's scary, but nobody would care about critical race theory if it wasn't going to give students the tools for change. Might have something to say about that later. So, what's comparative literature? Often when I tell people, then I come from a comparative literature background, they're like, what is that? Are you just working in translation? And I mean, it kind of comes from that, working in translation, working across cultures in that way. But complet, as we call it, has also in the last couple decades become much more free, especially in the department that I was working in. It's really about cultural studies. It's about connecting literatures across both time and space. And it says here, Susan Basnet's got a great book about this from 1993. So it's pretty old now, but I think it's still quite relevant. You often come to complet later, traveling towards it from different points of departure. Sometimes the journey begins with a desire to move beyond the boundaries of a single subject area that might appear to be too constraining, or other times a reader might be impelled to follow up with what appears to be similarities between texts or authors from different cultural contexts. And so it just made sense for me in that way. And a lot of my classmates in Hong Kong were coming from very different angles. They were lawyers, musicians, also other teachers, other artists, painters, for example. So I think we really complemented each other well when we were trying to move toward meaning making together in the classroom. Somebody who talks about this, who's really interesting to check out too, is Mary Midgley. She's a philosopher who she died in, I think it was 2018, and wrote this book the same year, published it the same year. And it really makes a case for not just philosophy, but putting the humanities and specifically the arts, back up there with the sciences, and not hierarchizing the disciplines in order to have a more balanced and ethical world. I mean, it's sort of the Frankenstein argument that if we go too far with, genetic mutation or something like that, right? Without bringing the artists and the philosophers and the historians to the table, we're going to go in some kind of scary places. So yeah, I would definitely check that out. So when I was doing my PhD, I was originally planning to stay in academia. And again, who knows, things are not linear, but partly because I found this love for fiction. And so I wanted to put my creative energy into fiction writing rather than academic writing. And partly because at least for the International Baccalaureate, which is the system I was teaching in, the English classroom was really changing to be one more of complet. And so it was, not only international, but interdisciplinary in the sense that we did interdisciplinary projects with, and we do with that curriculum now still, with many other subject areas all across the board, but even within the arts. So we started to teach film and media studies, even social media, and bring theory, although it wasn't a part of the curriculum. More teachers were starting to bring it to the classroom. And so I found this an exciting opportunity to maybe do something with what I had learned, and think about how, high school students could really access it. And so as part of that work, I wrote a couple of books for Hatchet, Hotter Education. One of them was for a newly designed course, and I had a chapter on using critical theory, which was really just my own idea to infuse the curriculum with more creativity and more social justice as well. So to get really students thinking politically, and what does this literature mean for me, for my community, for different cultures, for the world. And so I guess I'm most proud of this chapter. So, if you want to check it out, and you don't have access, just send me an email and I can help you to take a look at some of that. But it really breaks down several theories and how teachers can use them in the classroom with their students with different texts. And then I co-wrote this one on English literature, which is for teachers and students. And here I'm really talking about cultural studies, talking about a Hong Kong poet, P.K. Lung, who did also some work with us at Hong Kong U. So I think that theory makes art relevant. I would say that it gives it kind of a knowledge foundation that can allow it to come to the table with other disciplines. And I think that then conversely, when I'm creating, I can be more aware of what I hope that relevance is. So it doesn't mean that every scene that I write in a fiction or every conversation is going to be like heavily loaded with critical theory, right? But it's kind of in the background of maybe the way I write about a place and its connection to identity, or the way I use language and sometimes multilingualism in text. Okay, so it's really about learning art from the inside out. Understanding not just critical theory, but these other elements deeply in order to create, rather than creating from like a blank slate, right? Or just your own personal experiences, which I think are also valid and important elements of knowledge. But for me, it would probably just become some sort of emo mess if I wrote that way. Yeah, so just to help you understand then a little bit more how my novels take shape, I included just a little bit about my PhD dissertation, which is kind of the biggest piece of critical theory academic work that I've done. It's about immigrant identities and the way laws can assert or deny these identities in public and private spaces. So I work a lot with spatial theory in that way. It's an international and interdisciplinary project. Drawing on the law, spatial theory, cultural studies, film theory, post-structuralism, psychoanalytic theory, queer theory, and more. But hopefully forming it into a more focused and understandable argument about these identities, and specifically looking at the filmic apartment space. So I was really interested in what this space has to do with people's identities and the way it's used by artists. So the spaces that migrants live in can change their entire experience. If the individual's new home enables positive relationships, either through other inhabitants or in allowing for meaningful connections to take place, then the apartment becomes a positive frame of intertextual conversation with the host country. A quote, cross-threshold between languages and cultures, this comes from Julia Kristeva, is likened to the intertextual interchange to the desire for the empty center of a donut. Not sure how many of you have come across this before in a way to look at intertextuality, but I really love it. That American pastry, which is a hole in the middle, corresponding here to the loss of meaning. And thus, Michael Raffater's envisions interpretation as a craving for the small cake, a craving satisfied only when consuming what is around the empty hole, the knot. The knot is a representation of the undefined infinite space that may be a black hole or mise en abîme of identity, the space that this paper links with a filmic apartment. And with protective laws and cultural acceptance for immigrants, the transient non-place of the apartment becomes one of desire for becoming. So becoming, if you're not aware of that term, there's different ways to look at it, but I, in this work, function mostly from what Jacques Derrida and Gilles Deleuze have said about it, and look at those in connection. You've got a lot about intertextuality here. You've got starting ideas of spatial theories about the non-place, about mise en abîme. So I'm playing with these things in my work. Okay, and so in this way, fiction becomes improvisation. Taking those ideas and making them into fictions becomes a kind of improvisation. I had a really interesting conversation recently for my other project I'm doing now, this newsletter, with a former student of mine named Ken Ross. And I was asking him about jazz and identity. And his answer really went back to what he had learned. So learned in terms of musical theory, not just so practicing the notes, understanding musical theory, understanding the history of the musicians, the composers, all their stories forming the music that he was playing, not only the music he was playing from the sheet, so reading music, but also through improvisation. So he's sort of expressing his own identity and creativity still through the theories that he had studied. And I think that in a way, that's what I'm trying to do with fiction. And I also see other authors who kind of work in this way, which I'll mention. Another person who helped me understand it this way was Raphan Kabe, who he does this thing, space and flow, which comes from yoga. And I did a workshop with him where he's also a jazz musician, and he likened his work to jazz in the sense that you need to really understand the formative work of yoga to then be able to move in new ways and create these new ideas. And so he talks about using constraints and limitations, in fact, to paradoxically reflect freedom. You can, in the slides, you can see just a 1-minute video of him performing here. It's really beautiful. I highly recommend it. So I mentioned there's other authors who do this. I'm not going to go into detail. You can read these quotes later if you want, but Paul Auster for sure comes to mind. He started his work, his professional work as a writer, as a translator in France, and really just the post-structuralists from France are everywhere in his work. And you can just see them everywhere. And then if you look at City of Glass, you can also see a really explicit kind of conversation about semiotics that he goes into. If you haven't read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, if you've only seen the film, please read this book. It's just such a cool book. It's about it's about a girl who witnesses her friend being killed by the police. And, sadly, this is still in the news, a young Black man killed by the police, and, her using her voice to speak out against it. And Angie Thomas uses cultural theory as a sort of implicit argument throughout the text. The girl is Christian and Muslim. She decides she's Chrislam. She's playing with culture herself. The protagonist is. She's also playing with using allusions all the way from Tupac to Taylor Swift to say something. She is playing a lot with code switching and language. You can see that in the top quote there that the narrator, the little girl on the cover there, she's kind of translating what other people are saying. And you can almost hear James Baldwin's "If Black English isn't a language, tell me what is," being kind of infused into this novel. So definitely check it out. There's Louise Erdrich, Indigenous writer, talks a lot about that amongst many other things in her work. Haruki Murakami, always loaded with illusions, but also I would say critical theory through allegory, through this international complete sort of look at text within his work. David Foster Wallace, I think, is just like a beautiful writer, and this is a book of his essays, where he really talks about like playing with genre, playing with language, and how he does it. Inua Ellams is a poet and playwright born in Nigeria, but he's a Londoner. We brought him in to do some workshops with high school students when I was working in Vienna. And it was just amazing the way he was talking about his identity as queer and as a third culture kid, and what that has to do with his writing, both from a personal and a more theoretical point of view. Carol Ann Duffy, also a lot of queer theory in her work, as well as feminist theory, just a great poet, and a lot of high school teachers are using her work now. There's a bunch of others there you can check out later on. So my novels, finally, we can get to. So, as I mentioned in the dissertation, I do a lot with spatial theory, so you might see that here, a lot with identity politics, playing with the border and liminal space, playing with this idea of internationalism and what that means. and relatedly multilingualism, whether it's infusing other languages within the text or just looking at language and meaning making. So the first novel I published was during my PhD, so you probably haven't heard of it because my time for marketing and my marketing skills kind of went by the wayside when I went back to working on the dissertation. But anyway, it takes place in Paris, as you can see in this picture. It's a story of a woman with a brain tumor, but don't worry, it's not a pessimistic book, and it's not all morbid. And I'll just read this first quote here. So, and I think I won't have to really say much about it. You can see that I'm playing with internationalism. It was as if she were a stranger on the American army base. She even felt more at home outside the security check on the Italian soil than what was supposedly an extended part of her home country. When one feels a stranger, there's no backbone left. There's no ability to verbiate identity. Rather, one may still be what one is, but may not extend that being to action. And without that, what use is identity at all? She thought about this in the base library, where she would visit old and new philosophers, escaping and making the most of the non-place, like a prisoner seeking education. She seeks answers. What is the value of art, the purpose of our senses, of family, of solitude, and not what is the meaning of life, but how to live, questions that come to her when she is alone. Okay, and the next novel that I wrote is called A Hong Kong Story. I haven't published it yet. I had some good response from agents, but they said it's about twice as long as they would like. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what I want to do with it, which is a different discussion. But as the title suggests, it takes place in Hong Kong. So I'm looking at a lot of the idea of Hong Kong identity, which I was investigating in my dissertation. Akbar Abbas comes to mind as a scholar who I'm really drawing on in the fiction here. He looks at the culture of disappearance and the way that we don't see what's already there. A lot of people call Hong Kong culture kind of a dearth of culture, but that's not really, well, I would say it's not true, and he would as well. So I try to capture that in the text. I'm also playing a lot with this idea of the apartment space in this and the next novel. So I'll just read this passage. In fact, one could view the same scene from a mountain not far away at all, but the engagement on the street view and the collapsed and abstract shapes of fitting so much culture into this dense urbanity. Let Ivy see even the very ordinary, a child walking alone with a backpack extending wider than his back, an Indian immigrant eating mango chips, an old woman on a bicycle carrying huge piles of cardboard for recycling, a driver in a green Kowloon taxi talking to his customer through the rearview mirror. Could the infinite be captured in all these people around her just as much as the views of skylines and harbor shapes? Everyone, including Ivy, coexisted in a harmony dependent on acceptances and understandings. People did not have to interact with one another, but they had to all be a part of the dance. Otherwise, they were swimming against a current and would either become depressed or leave. She had seen it many times with both locals and foreigners, and although they had a right to complain about some things in the city, pollution, overcrowding, a lack of really good tomatoes, there would be something to complain about anywhere. Here, you maybe had to just search a little bit deeper. Unlike the Haussmann Paris, Hong Kong, and especially Kowloon, had grown organically from the streets. It looked like a beautiful chaos. From the mountains, it looked like huge mythical animals. Great Britain had carved into or even taken over local neighborhoods on Central and reclaimed land to build their empire. There were still some, though much fewer, Englishmen living on Central Island who would not cross to the, quote, dark side of Kowloon. Sorry, I'm working between the different versions of the quotes I have here. But yeah, a lot of this also comes back to the spatial history of Hong Kong and what that means in terms of post-colonialism and this sort of strange relationship that Hong Kong has with colonialism. Okay, and then the book that I'm working on now is a thriller, which has been really fun to write. I'm in the editing stages of An Interpreter in Vienna. It takes place in Vienna, as the title suggests. And it's kind of a response to The Third Man. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that film and the book, which actually followed the film by Graham Greene. He originally wrote the screenplay. which I'll show you a little bit of that in a second. So just, it says here, yes, I know, but will you likely, you will likely learn some things. If you do, just let me know about it and we will navigate together. Best not to try this alone. Have you seen The Third Man yet? It would be the first of many times that people ask me that question. Somehow, outsiders dwelling in Vienna thought it was a kind of beautiful homage to the city, even though I would find it to be dystopic, only highlighting the city's cracked base of existence. So yeah, there's in the slides, you can see the trailer here, but The Third Man has iconic topography, like the Ferris wheel you see in the photograph there, a historical understanding of culture, looking at translation and multilingualism. It's in noir and detective genres. It's about Vienna just after World War II, and it was divided into these different Allied powers, and where the whole spy world of Vienna, which is still existent today, really began. So I thought it was kind of a setting ripe for a thriller, and I'll look at it from the perspective of a linguist. So the protagonist is an interpreter, and so she's constantly playing with language as well as those areas. So right now, as I mentioned, I am writing that fiction. I'm also working on a newsletter called The Matterhorn, where I play around with critical theory and cultural studies directly with my readership. So it's different from academic writing. I mean, it's still, I still do research. I still, cite my sources, things like that. But it's a little bit more casual in tone, and it's to reach, I would say, a wider audience. So for a different purpose. I do miss the conversations I have teaching. I'm hoping to actually, I've just done my yoga teacher training, and I'm planning to do something with yoga and writing soon. So I'll get to work with students again soon. But right now I'm really excited about these projects and the way that I've been able to form like a digital kinning, I would say, with a lot of other, not just writers, but other artists and people interested in theory who are out there. So, there's different reasons, as I mentioned, why I write the Substack newsletter. And one of them is to develop a brand as an artist. And some people don't really like to say that, or to the last bit, to make a little money. But I think those are really important things. What am I creating here? What's the purpose? How is it even marketable? And I think that's important, because otherwise, artistry without money and commercial value just stays at the margins. And so, I think this is a debate that kind of flows through artistry. To what extent should it be also about making money or not? And what does that have to do with bringing it to the so-called, bringing it to the table of interdisciplinary discussions? Artists need to make money too. So anyway, that's something to think about. Not that this is making loads of money, but I think it's being talked about a lot on Substack. So if you're interested in that, I would head over there to look. This is the publication. As you can see, I'm quoting Julia Kristeva and the intertextuality idea from the start. Matterhorn is actually, I came up with the name because I see it as a kind of a symbol of intertextuality. I was skiing there, and on one side it's Swiss, on the other side it's Italian. You can just ski from one side to the other, but you can feel the cultural differences almost immediately. You can see them, you can hear them, you can taste them. And there's just sort of this lovely coexistence at that border. And I was there when, sadly, war broke out in Ukraine. And so I was really thinking about kind of the privilege of having this open border that had also been closed during COVID, and what that means. And anyway, if you're interested in that, you can read about it in that article as well. So why do we learn theory as creators, not just writers? These are discussion questions or thinking questions. How have you already used it? Does it influence the way you understand other texts or your own? How does it differ in regards to your artistic medium or mediums? How might you use it in the future? Are you aware of intertextual dialogues as you create? Does it inhibit or enhance the work? How might theory impact your path as a creator? And I'm talking, mainly to students here at Pratt, but it can really be anyone on their journey as a creator. Does theory ever inhibit your work as an artist? and how so? Does it maybe limit where your work can go or what it means to other people as well? I don't know. It could go in a lot of different directions. And then besides creating, how might we use critical theory and historical understandings of the arts beyond teaching academic writing and creating art? How might different uses of this knowledge be complementary? So I'm sure a lot of you are also in different professions or have different interests. And, I'm just curious where else we can take this, because I don't think it has to sit in this smaller realm. I think we can really bring it to everyone. And this is what I see with high school students, is that it is really actually quite accessible to everyone. It's just allowing people to use it and get excited about it and make meaning from it. So we can't really do questions on a recording, but you can leave them in the comments, or you can send them to me directly. And I just want to thank you even for listening to this recording and for supporting the work that I'm doing. If any of you are on the newsletter already or want to be, and want access to the paid content, which is about half the content or so. But if you can't afford it right now because you're a student or an artist without a collab with Louis Vuitton or something like that, just send me an email and we'll work something out, at least for a year. I'll just give you a comp account. So thanks again. And I hope that this helped you with your own creative process.